There's a fire you can build with nothing but a shovel that burns hotter than your campfire, on a fraction of the wood, with almost no smoke standing up off it. The United States Army still prints the diagram, figure 7-2, in the survival manual. Dig a hole, dig a second hole beside it, angled down to meet it at the bottom. Build the fire in the first one. But carry a shovel into most American campgrounds today, and that fire will get you a citation. And the reason why is not the reason you've been told. Start with what the hole actually does, because the moment you understand that, everything else about this story makes sense. A fire needs 3 things: air, heat, and fuel. The Army manual puts it exactly that way in the first paragraph of its firecraft chapter, and then it says something most people skim right past. The correct ratio of those 3 matters more than the amount of any one of them. You can pile up all the oak in the county and still build a poor fire, because what you are short of is air. Now look at what happens down in that pit. The fire heats the air around it, and hot air rises, and it climbs up out of the fire chamber and off into the trees. That rising column leaves low pressure behind it. Down in the hole, something has to fill that space, and the only easy path in is that angled tunnel you dug on the windward side. So cold air gets pulled through the tunnel, down under the burning wood, and straight up through the coal bed. That is a loop. The hotter it burns, the harder the air rises. The harder the air rises, the more air gets sucked in through the side tunnel. The more air gets sucked in, the hotter it burns. You dug a bellows into the dirt, and you never have to pump it. The same Army manual describes this effect in plain language somewhere else, in the instructions for a shallow cross-shaped trench cut into the soil. The ditch, it says, allows air to sweep under the tinder to provide a draft. Same principle, smaller scale. Air from below beats air from the side every single time, and every blacksmith who ever worked a forge already knew it. So the fire runs hot. That is the first thing. The second thing is the part that makes people's eyes go wide, and it comes down to a fact about smoke that almost nobody has ever been told. Smoke is not something a fire makes. Smoke is fuel that got away from you. When wood heats up, it stops behaving like a solid and starts giving off gas, and it is that gas burning that you see as flame above the log. Give that gas enough air and enough heat, and it burns off almost completely, and what leaves the fire is mostly warm air and water vapor. Starve it, and those unburned compounds cool, gather into fine particles, and drift off as the gray cloud that follows you around the ring and soaks into your jacket. The California Air Resources Board describes the particles in wood smoke in exactly those terms, as the result of unburned fuel. That one fact about smoke is the sort of thing that used to get handed to you across a fire by somebody older, and then never got written down anywhere you could find it again. That gap is what the Native American way was put together to close. It's a plain written record in them of the old skills laid out step by step, the backyard remedies, the wild foods, and when to gather them, food preservation, the old way, fire and shelter work, and the cooking that fed people through winter. It's for the person who bought the $40 camp gadget that did one job badly and stood there thinking there has to be an older answer than this. There is, and it's been tested longer than anything on a shelf. Now go ahead and grab your phone and open up your camera, the same one you use to take pictures. Point it at that square code on your screen and hold it steady for a second. a little link will pop up. Give it a tap, and it will take you straight to the book. And if you're watching on your phone right now, the link is waiting for you right down below in the description. Take your time, there is no rush at all. I'll wait right here. So hold those two facts side by side, because together they explain the whole design. Smoke is wasted fuel, and the hole in the ground is a machine for forcing air through the fire. Put those together, and you get a fire that burns its own smoke. Not all of it. Anybody who tells you a fire hole is completely smokeless has never sat beside one on a damp morning. But the difference between a proper draft fire in a pit and a lazy pile of wood on the ground is the difference between a clean gas flame and a smudge pot, and you can see it from across a clearing. The Environmental Protection Agency spent years telling people the same thing about the stoves in their own houses. The more efficiently you burn the wood, the less smoke gets created in the first place. Every word of that applies to a hole in the dirt exactly as much as it applies to a cast iron stove in a living room. Now here's the part that matters if you have ever tried to cook outdoors in weather. Wind does not put out a fire by blowing the flame away. Wind puts out a fire by carrying the heat off faster than the fire can make it. Stand a small flame up on open ground with a hard wind coming across the field, and the heat gets stripped sideways off the burning surface. The fuel drops below its ignition temperature, and the whole thing dies while you're still cupping your hands around it. This is why people build rock walls and hunker behind logs and prop up windbreaks that fall over. Drop that same fire 12 or 15 inches down into the ground and the problem stops existing. The wind goes over the top. The heat stays in the chamber, bouncing off the soil walls back into the coals. And the only air reaching the fire is the air being pulled up through the tunnel where you want it. The ground is the windbreak. You didn't build it, you just got out of the weather. And once the draft is doing the work, the fuel requirement collapses. This is the part people misjudge, and it's the reason most first attempts go badly. A pit fire does not want logs. It wants small diameter wood, sticks about the thickness of your finger to about the thickness of your wrist, fed in steadily instead of stacked in a pile. Because the air is moving so fast through that coal bed, thin wood gives up its gas immediately and burns it right there in the chamber. Thick wood just sits in the way, smoldering, choking the very draft that makes the whole thing work. A double handful of dry sticks in a good pit will boil a pot faster than an armload of split wood on the surface, and it will do it while you're still walking back with the second armload you turned out not to need. There's one more piece, and it is the piece that tells you these holes were dug by people who actually cooked in them, rather than people who wrote about them. The mouth of the fire chamber is narrow. A regular campfire spreads its heat across 3 or 4 feet of ground and up into the air, and you stand there holding a pan over it, turning your knuckles red, trying to find the one spot that isn't too hot or too cold. The pit concentrates all of that into an opening the size of a dinner plate. Lay a few flat rocks around the rim, or 2 green sticks straight across, and you have a stove burner. The pot sits directly over the hottest column of gas in the entire fire. Nothing radiates off sideways to warm the trees, which brings up the honest limitation, and I'd rather you hear it from me than find it out at 2 in the morning. This fire will not keep you warm. It was never meant to. All that efficiency comes from sending the heat straight up through a small opening instead of throwing it out in every direction. So if you are cold and sitting beside a fire hole, you are going to stay cold. For warmth, you want an open fire with a reflector behind it, which is a different tool for a different job. The pit is a cooking fire and a hiding fire. Judge it on those, and it has very few equals. There is a second limitation, and it is a far more serious one than being cold. It has nothing to do with how the fire performs while you are sitting there watching it. It has to do with what the fire is doing after you leave. Hold on to that, because it turns out to be the real answer to the question this whole video is built on. And almost nobody who teaches this fire ever mentions it. So that's the machine. Now let's talk about who built it, because the story you have probably heard is wrong, and the truth is a good deal more impressive. Search this fire online, and you will find the same paragraph copied onto 100 different pages. The Dakota people invented it on the northern plains to hide their cooking fires from the wind and keep sparks out of the prairie grass while they followed the bison. It is a tidy story. It has a place, a people, and a reason, and it gets repeated with total confidence. Here is what nobody copying that paragraph tends to mention. There is no primary record behind it. No account from the period names the inventor, names the band, or describes the moment. Even the survival schools that teach this fire will tell you so if you read carefully enough. One of them puts it flatly on their own instructional page. No one knows who first invented this method, and the basic concept turns up in various places and cultures throughout the world. Now, that is not me taking anything away from anybody. Watch where this goes, because it goes somewhere better. The name on the fire is 19th and 20th century American shorthand. Somebody wrote it in a manual. The manual got copied into the next manual, and the label stuck the way labels do. What the label points at, though, is far older and far wider than one nation on one set of plains. Cooking in a hole is one of the oldest things human beings do. The archaeologists have a name for the family this belongs to: earth ovens, pits dug into the ground, loaded with rock and fire, used to bake and steam and roast. And the record of them is staggering. A survey of the evidence published in the journal American Antiquity puts earth ovens across roughly 30,000 years in the Old World and about 10,000 years in North America. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources says the earliest earth ovens found on this continent are more than 8,000 years old. Down in central Texas, at a site called Wilson Leonard, archaeologists pulled charred camas bulbs out of a hearth feature and radiocarbon dated them to roughly 8,000 years before the present. Somebody dug a pit, filled it with hot rock, buried a load of wild bulbs in it, and walked away from a meal that we are still finding the crumbs of 80 centuries later. And up at Head Smashed in Buffalo Jump in southern Alberta, where people hunted and processed bison for 6,000 years, a crew uncovered a roasting pit that had never been disturbed, about 1,600 years old, intact, the rock still where it was set. So look again at the number in the title of this video: 200 years. 200 years is not wrong so much as it is embarrassing. 200 years is roughly how long people have been writing this technique down in English. The technique itself has been in continuous use on this continent since before the pyramids, and across the world for longer than that, in Australia, in Polynesia, in Mexico, in southern France and Japan. So the pit oven is not really anybody's invention. Separate people on separate continents who had never heard of each other arrived at it independently over and over for the same reason a wheel keeps getting reinvented. It is what the ground offers you if you pay attention. What the Plains nations get credit for and deserve credit for is the refinement. Because a straight cooking pit and a two-hole draft fire are not quite the same animal. That angled tunnel is an engineering choice. Somebody, somewhere, watched a fire in a hole breathe, understood what the moving air was doing, and cut a second opening to feed it on purpose. That is not folk luck. That is applied physics, worked out by observation in a place where getting it wrong meant a grass fire that could ruin the hunting for 100 miles. And they were doing it without a single instrument, generations before anybody in Europe wrote down a theory of combustion to explain why it worked. That is the part that should stop you. Not the mystery of who. The fact that the how was solved so thoroughly, so long ago, by so many separate people, that the United States Army in the 21st century still prints the diagram without feeling the need to improve it, which raises the obvious question. If this thing is that old, that good, and that widely known, how does a skill like that go missing? It went missing on a schedule, and the schedule is documented. August 1910. Northern Idaho and western Montana. Hundreds of small fires that had been burning quietly through a dry summer got caught by hurricane-force winds and joined together in about 2 days. Roughly 3 million acres of timber went up. Whole towns burned. At least 85 people were killed, most of them firefighters. Some of them found where they had tried to outrun it. In the history books, it is called the Big Blow-Up, and the smoke from it reached the eastern seaboard. The young Forest Service was 5 years old. Its people came out of those 2 days with one conviction burned into them, and it never really left. If they had only had more men, more trails, more equipment, more money, it could have been stopped. Therefore, every fire, everywhere, must be stopped. Now, up until that summer, there had been a real argument going on in American forestry, and it is an argument most people have never heard about. One side wanted total suppression. The other side wanted what they called light burning. Set low-intensity fires deliberately in the cool, wet part of the year, and burn off the dead needles and fallen limbs and brush on the forest floor before it can pile up deep enough to carry a monster. It was not a new idea, and nobody pretended it was. It was borrowed openly from what native people across the continent had been doing for thousands of years. The National Park Service says it plainly in its own fire history for the Northern Rockies. Indigenous people regularly and intentionally burned the country to clear undergrowth, to build wildlife habitat, to support hunting, to bring on huckleberries, and to keep the fuel down so the big fires had nothing to eat. And as Anglo-American settlers moved west, those traditional burning practices were suppressed and in many cases banned outright. The light burning advocates were arguing, in effect, that the older way had been right. They lost. And the way they lost is worth hearing, because it wasn't lost on evidence. It was lost on a nickname. Light burning got labeled Paiute forestry. That was the phrase, and it was not meant kindly. It was a sneer at the fact that the practice came from Indian country, and the whole rhetorical job of those two words was to make a documented land management technique sound like backwoods superstition that no serious professional would touch. The man most associated with driving that framing home was William Greeley, who fought the 1910 fires as a young forester and later ran the Forest Service. Greeley's view won, and the record of what winning meant is not in dispute. Until the 1960s, the Forest Service worked to exclude fire from most of the nation's wildlands. Read that again slowly. The stated objective was to keep fire off most of the country's wild land altogether. 25 years after the big blow-up, the last piece locked into place. 1935. The chief of the Forest Service by then was Ferdinand Silcox, who had also been out there in 1910 as a young district man. Silcox issued the standard that came to be known as the 10 a.m. policy, and it is exactly as absolute as it sounds. Any fire reported anywhere on the national forest was to be controlled by 10 o'clock the morning after it was spotted. Fail that, and you plan the next day around the same goal, and the next until you have it. It was not a suggestion. It was the operating doctrine of the largest land management agency in the country, and other federal agencies fell in behind it. The Civilian Conservation Corps poured enormous labor into fire roads, fire lookouts, and fire crews. War surplus equipment came home and got handed to fire programs. Aircraft started dropping retardant, and in 1944, a bear in a ranger hat turned up on a poster and taught 2 generations of American children that fire in the outdoors is the enemy, full stop. The 10 a.m. policy stood until 1978. Now stack the calendar up against a human life, because this is where the title of this video is exactly right. A child born on this continent in 1900 grew up in a country where deliberate ground fire was still a living, working tool, practiced by native communities, by ranchers, by farmers burning their own fields, by anybody who understood that you take the fuel down on your own terms or the weather takes it down on its. That same person, by middle age, lived in a country where ground fire was a thing you called in, ran from, and got fined for. Not one skill was refuted. Nobody proved the pit fire was inefficient or that light burning did not work, because it does work, and the agency itself now says so and runs prescribed burns on that basis. The knowledge did not lose an argument. It lost an institution, and in one lifetime, that was enough. But suppression policy is only half of why you cannot dig this fire today. The other half is more recent. It came from people with nothing but good intentions, and it is the half nobody argues with. If you have taken a child through Scouts in the last 30 years or picked up a trailhead pamphlet at a national park, you already know the 7 principles of leave no trace. Plan ahead. Travel and camp on durable surfaces. Dispose of waste properly. Leave what you find. Minimize campfire impacts. Respect wildlife. Be considerate of others. I want to be careful here because I have no quarrel with any of that. Those principles exist because American backcountry was getting loved to death by sheer numbers, and they have done an enormous amount of good. But read the actual wording under 2 of them, and you will find the fire hole quietly written out of existence. Under leaving what you find, the wording is to avoid altering a site, digging trenches, or building structures. Under minimizing campfire impacts, where fires are permitted, use established fire rings, fire pans, or mound fires. Established fire rings, that is the whole list. A ring of rocks somebody else already placed. A metal pan you carried in. or a mound of mineral soil laid on top of the ground. Every one of those keeps the fire above the surface, and that is deliberate because the ethic is built around a simple and reasonable idea. Leave the ground the way you found it. A dug pit is an alteration. A dug pit shows. And then comes a sentence that finishes the job. Lightweight camp stoves, the guidance says, make low-impact camping possible. There it is. Nothing was banned and nothing was hidden. The skill was simply replaced with a purchase. Think about what that sentence actually does. It takes a skill that lives in your hands and your judgment and the shovel on your pack, and it substitutes a manufactured object that you buy, carry, fuel with a canister, and eventually throw away. And it does it for a defensible reason. On land that genuinely cannot absorb 10,000 people a year, each digging their own hole. I want to say that clearly. On a crowded trail corridor, that guidance is correct. But notice who is left standing when the rule generalizes. The person on their own deer lease, the person on their own 80 acres, the person on a working ranch or a family woodlot or out in country where nobody has walked in a month. They inherit a prohibition written for Yosemite in July, and after a generation of hearing it, they don't just stop digging the fire. They stop knowing it exists. That is what erasure actually looks like in practice, and it almost never looks like a ban. Nobody came and took anything. The policy made the skill illegal in the places most people go. The ethic made it rude in the places that were left. And the market showed up with a lightweight alternative that required no skill at all, which meant that within about one generation there was no longer anybody around to teach it, because there was nowhere left to practice. So before we go any further, let me put the practical part where you cannot miss it. Whatever ground you are standing on has somebody responsible for it, and that somebody sets the fire rules and changes them week to week through the season. Check the current restrictions with the agency or the landowner before you strike a match, and follow whatever tested guidance is in force where you are, not what a man on a screen tells you. That is not me covering myself. That is the first step of the skill. Because there is a real reason for caution here. And it is not the one in the regulations. It is in the physics. Everything good about this fire comes from one decision. You put the heat underground. That is what gives you the draft. That is what gives you the wind protection. That is what gives you the concealment and the fuel economy and the clean burn. Every advantage on the list traces back to the same move. And that same move is exactly what makes this fire capable of something an open campfire on bare rock simply cannot do. It puts sustained heat directly into soil you cannot see into. Walk out into most timber country and kick the surface with your boot. Under the loose needles and leaves, there is a layer that does not look like much and matters enormously. Foresters call it duff. Partly rotted needles, bark, leaf litter, and root hair, packed together sometimes several inches thick, full of air pockets and old organic material. When it is dry, duff will hold a smolder the way a cigar holds an ember, not a flame. A slow, oxygen-starved burn that creeps sideways through the layer, hour after hour, giving off almost nothing you would notice. And beneath the duff there are roots, woody, resinous, running out from every tree around you and down into the ground, and in some species reaching down 15 to 25 feet to find water. The Los Angeles Fire Department has published guidance on precisely this hazard. Those deep root systems act as a hidden fuel reserve. After the visible fire is gone, the roots keep smoldering underground, slowly, holding heat for a very long time, and the fire can travel through the soil along them. Scott Stevens, a fire scientist at the University of California at Berkeley, has described how little it takes. A smoldering fragment the size of a quarter can keep burning for months. Rotten root wood is the worst of it, because it is full of fissures, and every fissure is another place a trace of oxygen can get in and keep the burn alive. You cannot see any of this. You cannot feel most of it. And water does not fix it, because the water runs off the surface and never reaches the depth where the smolder is living. Now put your fire hole back into that picture. You have dug down through the surface layer and set a very hot, forced draft fire directly against the walls and the floor of a chamber cut into duff and root ground. You have run that fire for 2 hours or 6 and driven heat straight into the soil in every direction. Then you cook your supper, kick the dirt back over it, feel the surface with your hand, find it cool, and drive home. Fire crews have a word for what can happen next: a holdover. In the first hours of January 1st, 2025, a fire started in the hills above Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles. Crews got on it fast. It was held to about 8 acres, no structures lost, and it was declared contained. By every visible measure, that fire was over, and everybody went home. Federal officials say it kept burning underground, inside the root structure of the dense brush, for about a week. Nobody knew. There was nothing to see. On January 7th, the Santa Ana winds came through hard, pulled oxygen down into the ground, and brought that fire back up to the surface. It became the Palisades Fire. 12 people died. Something on the order of 7,000 homes and businesses were destroyed, and the whole thing had been standing right there in the dirt the entire week, waiting on wind. I am not telling you that story to frighten you off a shovel, and I am not telling you a campfire hole caused it, because it did not. I am telling you because it is the clearest proof anybody has ever put on the record of the one thing you have to respect about putting fire in the ground. The ground does not report back. A surface fire on mineral soil tells you when it is out. Buried heat tells you nothing at all, and it will keep its own counsel for a week or a season or right through a winter. So the rangers writing those citations are not enforcing a grudge against old skills. Some of them probably could not tell you where the rule came from. But underneath the rule, there's a genuine, measured physical fact, and it is the same fact that makes the fire work. The draft that gives you a clean flame is the draft that drives heat into the roots. That is the honest answer to the title of this video. Not that somebody buried the knowledge. The knowledge was buried by a policy that lost an argument on a nickname, then by an ethic that had a real problem to solve, and it stayed buried because the one thing that makes this fire remarkable is the one thing that makes it hard to walk away from safely. Which leaves one question. If the physics is that good, where did it go? It didn't go anywhere. Somebody put a price on it. In 1980, Larry Winiarski went to work on a problem at a research center in Cottage Grove, Oregon. He was an engineer, and the problem was that billions of people cook over open fires, burning enormous quantities of scarce wood and filling their houses with smoke. He wanted a cook stove that used a fraction of the fuel and put out almost nothing you could see. By 1982, he had the principles written down. Insulate the combustion chamber so the fire stays as hot as possible. Put a short upright chimney directly above the fire to increase the draft. Do not let too much or too little air into the chamber, and feed the fuel in a little at a time, burning the tips of the sticks as they enter, so you are only ever heating the wood that is actually burning. Read that list again with a shovel in your hand, an enclosed chamber that holds its heat instead of losing it sideways, a vertical passage above the fire that pulls air through it, air metered in at one controlled opening, small sticks fed in at the tips instead of logs piled on top. That is the pit. That is exactly, line for line, the pit, turned right side up and built out of metal and fire brick. They call it a rocket stove. You can buy one this afternoon. They sit on shelves in camping stores and emergency preparedness catalogs, and they are sold, quite honestly, on the two things they genuinely deliver, which are a hot, clean burn and hardly any wood. Winiarski's work has gone into more than 20 countries and has won awards for it. And every bit of that is deserved, because he took a principle and engineered it into something that could be manufactured and shipped to people who needed it. But nothing about that principle was invented in Oregon in 1980. It was worked out on this continent, in the dirt, with a digging stick by people who did not need a theory of combustion to know that air from below beats air from the side. It was practiced for thousands of years, refined into a two-hole draft design on the plains, copied into a military manual, sneered at as Paiute forestry, excluded from the national forest by doctrine, and finally written out of American camping by a sentence recommending a lightweight stove. And then it came back in a box with a warranty. That is what happened to this fire. The knowledge moved out of people's hands and into products, one reasonable decision at a time, until the only version most Americans could get was the version somebody manufactured. Every one of those decisions had a defender who was at least partly right, and the total of all of them is that a skill which cost nothing but a shovel and an afternoon of attention now arrives shrink-wrapped with a barcode on the side. The good news is that the original is not gone, and it never was. It's in a government manual anybody can read. It's in the archaeology under half the continent, and the physics of it works today exactly the way it worked 8,000 years ago at a commerce pit in Texas. Where the ground and the rules allow it, you can go out and prove all of it to yourself before dark with a shovel, a handful of finger-thick sticks, and one match. That's one page out of the kind of knowledge collected in the Native American way, from reading the ground you're standing on to feeding a fire that feeds you, written down plain so it stops depending on somebody being alive to tell you. Now go ahead and grab your phone and open up your camera and point it at that square code on your screen and hold it steady for a second. A little link will pop up, give it a tap, and it will take you straight to the book. And if you are watching on your phone right now, the link is waiting for you right down below in the description. Now, if you enjoyed this video, you will enjoy the video right now on screen even more. I can assure you on that. Click it right now, my friend.